So the question is, are you ready? So I ask, are you ready? By the time you finish your degree, you would have been in education roughly for 15 years, more or less. And we could think that in 15 years, you would have somehow been prepared for life. And you have, to some extent, mostly though, through what has happened outside the classroom. And that's the thought that I would like us to reflect on today. And by the way, it's something that we kind of know. We know that your education has mostly prepared you for a successful career, but a successful life, that's another story. So as we bring the academic year to an end and prepare for graduation season, I think it's a good time to reflect upon the educational journey that is coming to an end by the time that you leave university, and what it has accomplished and what it has not. And it's an important, by the way, it's an important reflection to have. For most people, the end of uni marks an important transition in life. You are for the first time going to be operating in the world as an independent adult in a way that you probably haven't done before. For the first time, you are not going to be a full-time student. You're going to be acquiring responsibilities that you haven't had before. So let's stop for a second and think. In the last 15 years, how much time have you spent learning about things like finances, building wealth, saving, building up your credit score, avoiding debt, which is probably going to become an important skill to have in the coming years for you, investing? Do you know how to invest? Unless you're coming from the School of Business, in which case, hopefully you know. But do you know how the stock market works? Do you own stocks? Do you know how to get stocks if you want it? How about your physical well-being? Do you know the basics of nutrition? Do you know your body? Do you know what kind of food to spike up your sugar levels? What a proper fiber intake per day is supposed to look like? What good sleeping and rest patterns are supposed to look like? What are the mechanisms through which some of the most common diseases develop, like diabetes, and what you can do to avoid them? How about your emotional well-being? Most experts agree we're living through a time in which we're facing the worst crisis of mental health, an epidemic of mental health. And yet, how many times do you recall learning about how to recover from a setback? How to cope with rejection? How to cope with frustration, which some of you might experience when you receive your marks? How about coping with uncertainty as you leave education for good and are wondering what life is going to look like next? How about anxiety? How about relationships? Do you know how to do relationships? You guys are good with relationships. Do you know how to be a good, active listener? How to be empathetic? How to approach conflict? These, of course, are not trivial things at all. And talking about a successful career, no matter how valuable of a degree you have, and we put great effort in what we do, and we believe you are living here with a valuable degree, but no matter, talking about a successful career without talking about that doesn't really make sense. And yet, these skills are mostly missing from any given curriculum. And by the way, the intention is by no way putting blame on anything or anyone. The world is far from perfect, and the systems are what they are. And there is progress, as we'll see in a minute. But it's important to think about this. You might be familiar with the podcast of the School of Life of Alain de Botton. And one of the things he says is that one of the biggest gaps he sees has to do with emotional intelligence. And we know, well, we are discovering that in fact we are a lot more emotional and a lot less rational beings that we tend to think we are. And so yet we are asked to be good lovers, good friends, to know how to solve conflict, how to communicate effectively, how to build long-lasting, fulfilling relationships, but we have never been taught how to do so. It's obviously not just relationships. We know that we are heavily biased beings. Kesh mentioned Kahneman in his talk. We know that we go through life with tinted glasses, looking at the world the way that we see it, the way we want it to be, not necessarily the way that it actually is. And that affects our decision making. We're not the greatest decision makers, not the most objective thinkers, with the consequence for us and everyone else. And yet, do you recall being taught how to become aware of your own biases, let alone handle them? How about developing a growth mindset? There is an increasing amount of research that shows that people who develop what's so-called a growth mindset cope with failure better, not surprisingly. And yet, when did we teach or learn what the growth mindset is, let alone develop one? So, can we truly talk about success in isolation? Can we actually talk about a successful career when your health is collapsing? Can we talk about sustaining achievement when your relationships are breaking down? Can we talk about a successful, meaningful life experience when you lack self-awareness, purpose? And I'm sure that there are plenty of examples that we can think of otherwise highly successful individuals who have struggled with several aspects of life. But there is progress. We're catching up. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development regularly publishes reports on macro trends on education and economics. And those reports increasingly highlight the fact that in an increasingly complex environment and an increasingly changing environment, such as the world in which we are living, it's not so much knowledge, but things like empathy, like adaptability, like emotional resilience, like awareness of oneself and others, are actually what matters. That in the future, in the near future, what's going to determine success is not so much what we know, but being able to successfully navigate an increasingly complex world. In other words, being empathic, being self-aware, being emotionally intelligent. I was glad to learn that elementary school children are learning about mindfulness. What essentially is some sort of mindfulness practice anyways, in a subject called PSHE, which stands for Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education, which aims to equip pupils with skills for life. Great. Some of you might recall it because the subject was introduced in the early 2000s, which, if I'm having my math more or less correctly, you would have been still around at that time, at that level. Some of you, because although the subject was introduced in the early 2000s, it didn't become statutory, compulsory, until relatively recently, 2020, 6 years ago. Actually, part of it became compulsory in 2020. The other part of it is only becoming compulsory later this year. So, on the one hand, great. As a society, we are realizing that things like mental health, relationships, and emotions are actually critical and should probably be part of the curriculum. On the other hand, we're catching up. And that means that there is some gap filling to do. And that's precisely the point. You might have heard of Edward de Bono. I'm not sure if he's still alive. You might have heard of him around the subject of lateral thinking and the 6 thinking hats. We used to do an exercise, 6 thinking hats in foundation. Anyways, he says that we should think about thinking as a skill that has to be learned, that has to be nurtured, that has to be developed. That just because we think doesn't mean that we know how to think. Let's think about that. And I think we can take that and extend it to life. Just because we're living doesn't mean that we know how to live. We should probably think of living as a skill that has to be acquired, that has to be developed, that has to be nurtured. And that takes effort, that takes intention, that takes time, that takes a method. So I would like to close with 2 thoughts. One, being intentional about your life skills. Think about your future. Think about your future life beyond your career. What does it look like? What kind of relationships would you like to build? What kind of physique would you like to have? What kind of mindset would you like to develop? And be intentional about the skills that will help you to get there. And second, to live. Some of you, in fact, in this case, since you are here, probably all of you for the most part, have developed stronger skills than your peers. And there's obviously multiple reasons for that, but I think a big one is definitely the fact that you have been engaging with life more and more meaningfully. Let's think about this. You made this happen. I don't have memory of a design society. Sure, we have had a design society. Certainly not one that would have made this happen. You might recall from our academic advising sessions that at some points we ask you, how are you doing beyond your studies? Are you taking advantage of the opportunities that the university has to offer for you to engage with other students, with other activities? So, no wonder that some of you have developed, have grown in that area more. But it takes courage, it takes stepping out of your comfort zone, it takes effort, it takes saying, yes, I'll do the talk, and then regretting it. So, live. Be cautious, by all means. We're living at a time where there's a lot of fear and anxiety, and it's easy to stand back and not engage with life out of fear. Be cautious, but try. Stay curious, and that will hopefully help you to grow, even if that still takes us a while to catch up in the curriculum.